Some nights, even the thought of turning on the oven feels like too much. But decades ago, tired American families faced the same feeling, and still found a way to end the day with something sweet. Hidden inside old cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards are desserts made for moments just like these, simple, comforting, and almost forgotten. No complicated steps. No long baking times. Just quick creations born from exhaustion, creativity, and a need for comfort. Tonight, we're stepping back into those quiet kitchens to rediscover 10 lazy desserts that once made hard days a little softer, and somehow disappeared. The recipe was often scribbled in the margins of worn-out cookbooks, passed quietly between generations who understood one simple truth. Some nights, you just didn't have the energy. This was the world where something called icebox cake became a small miracle in American kitchens. Long before modern convenience desserts lined grocery store shelves, families relied on simple ingredients that required almost no effort. Icebox cake didn't ask for an oven, precise timing, or even much skill. It asked for patience and a refrigerator. In the 1930s, as iceboxes became more common in American homes, this dessert slowly found its place on dinner tables. All it needed were chocolate wafer cookies and freshly whipped cream. The process felt almost too easy. Layers of cookies, then cream, repeated again and again until a quiet tower formed inside a dish. No baking. No heat. Just assembly. But something strange happened overnight. As the dessert rested in the cold, the crisp cookies softened, absorbing the cream until the layers transformed into something entirely new. By morning, what once felt like separate ingredients had become a smooth, cake-like texture. It sliced like a baked dessert, even though it had never seen an oven. For tired mothers during the Great Depression, for workers coming home late, for families who needed comfort without effort, this dessert was more than convenience. It was relief. It was proof that something sweet could still exist, even on the hardest days. Today, icebox cake rarely appears the way it once did, simple, quiet, and untouched by modern shortcuts. But hidden in its layers is a memory of slow nights, dim kitchens, and the kind of exhaustion that didn't stop people from finding sweetness anyway. There was a time when dessert didn't come from an oven. It came from whatever was left in the pantry. And on the most exhausting days, when even mixing batter felt like too much, families turned to something strangely simple, something known as banana pudding. Not the modern version layered with extras and shortcuts, but the older kind, quiet, humble, and built from necessity. In the early 20th century, bananas had just become widely available across the United States, shipped in from distant shores and sold cheaply enough for everyday families. They ripened quickly, sometimes too quickly, turning soft and spotted before anyone had the energy to use them. That's where this dessert began. Instead of letting those overripe bananas go to waste, they were sliced and layered into a dish with vanilla wafers and a basic custard, often store-bought or made with minimal effort. There was no baking involved. Just soft layers pressed together, left to sit, and slowly transform. Like many forgotten desserts, time did most of the work. As the pudding rested, the wafers absorbed moisture, losing their crunch and becoming tender, almost cake-like. The bananas softened further, blending into the custard in a way that felt comforting rather than fancy. By the time it reached the table, it wasn't just a dessert. It was something gentle, something easy to eat after a long, tiring day. During the 1940s and 50s, it became a staple in many homes, especially in the South, where gatherings didn't require perfection, just something sweet to share. It didn't demand attention. It didn't need decoration. It simply existed, ready in the refrigerator, waiting quietly. Today, banana pudding often appears dressed up, layered with whipped toppings and extras. But the original version tells a different story, one of fatigue, resourcefulness, and making something soft and sweet out of what might have been thrown away. There was a dessert that didn't need baking, mixing bowls, or even much thought. It appeared quietly at the end of long days, when the kitchen felt too heavy to stand in any longer. All it required was a can opener, and a little patience. They called it fruit cocktail delight. In the 1940s and 50s, canned fruit was more than convenience. It was security. Tucked away in pantry shelves, it waited for the nights when fresh ingredients were out of reach, or energy had simply run out. Among those cans, fruit cocktails stood out. A strange mixture of peaches, pears, grapes, and cherries, suspended in syrup. It was already sweet, already softened, already done. On the most tiring evenings, that was enough. The process felt almost too simple to be called a recipe. The can was opened, the syrup sometimes drained, sometimes not. The fruit was poured into a bowl, then topped with whatever was available, perhaps a scoop of whipped cream, maybe a handful of shredded coconut, or even a sprinkle of sugar if the syrup felt too thin. There were no rules, no measurements. Just instinct. And yet, something about it worked. Served cold, straight from the icebox, it offered a kind of quiet comfort. The fruit was soft, the sweetness gentle, the texture easy. It didn't try to impress. It didn't ask for effort. It simply existed, ready within minutes, asking nothing from the person making it. For families living through busy decades, post-war routines, long work hours, and endless responsibilities, this dessert became a small reward at the end of the day. Not because it was special, but because it was easy. Today, fruit cocktail delight is almost forgotten, replaced by elaborate desserts and complicated recipes. But hidden in its simplicity is a memory of exhaustion, and the quiet ways people still found something sweet, even when they had nothing left to give. There was a dessert that barely felt like cooking at all. No oven, no stove, no real preparation, just a quiet habit formed on nights when energy had completely run out. It was known in many homes as peanut butter bread balls, though no one could quite remember where the name came from. It often began with something left over. A few slices of plain white bread, slightly stale, sitting untouched at the edge of the kitchen. Throwing them away felt wasteful, but turning them into something new felt like too much effort. So, a simpler solution took shape. The crusts were sometimes removed, sometimes not. The bread was pressed flat by hand, soft and yielding, then spread with a thin layer of peanut butter. Nothing fancy, just whatever jar was already open. After that, it was rolled into small, tight balls, the peanut butter holding everything together like a quiet glue. That was it. No baking. No waiting. No transformation overnight. Just a few minutes of motion, and something small and edible appeared. Sometimes, if there was a little extra energy, the balls were rolled in sugar or drizzled with a bit of syrup. Other times, they were left plain, placed on a plate, and eaten without ceremony. They weren't meant to impress anyone. They weren't even meant to last long. For children, they felt like a treat. For tired adults, they felt like a shortcut, a way to offer something sweet without standing in the kitchen any longer than necessary. This was the kind of dessert that rarely made it into cookbooks. It lived instead in memory, passed quietly from one tired evening to the next. And while it may seem almost too simple to remember, it carries something deeper, a reflection of nights when effort was gone, but the need for comfort still remained. There was a dessert that barely felt like cooking at all. No oven, no stove, no real preparation, just a quiet habit formed on nights when energy had completely run out. It was known in many homes as peanut butter bread balls, though no one could quite remember where the name came from. It often began with something left over. A few slices of plain white bread, slightly stale, sitting untouched at the edge of the kitchen. Throwing them away felt wasteful, but turning them into something new felt like too much effort. So, a simpler solution took shape. The crusts were sometimes removed, sometimes not. The bread was pressed flat by hand, soft and yielding, then spread with a thin layer of peanut butter. Nothing fancy, just whatever jar was already open. After that, it was rolled into small, tight balls, the peanut butter holding everything together like a quiet glue. That was it. No baking. No waiting. No transformation overnight. Just a few minutes of motion, and something small and edible appeared. Sometimes, if there was a little extra energy, the balls were rolled in sugar or drizzled with a bit of syrup. Other times, they were left plain, placed on a plate, and eaten without ceremony. They weren't meant to impress anyone. They weren't even meant to last long. For children, they felt like a treat. For tired adults, they felt like a shortcut, a way to offer something sweet without standing in the kitchen any longer than necessary. This was the kind of dessert that rarely made it into cookbooks. It lived instead in memory, passed quietly from one tired evening to the next. And while it may seem almost too simple to remember, it carries something deeper, a reflection of nights when effort was gone, but the need for comfort still remained. There was a dessert that felt almost accidental, as if it had been discovered rather than created. It didn't come from a recipe card or a cookbook, but from quiet moments in the kitchen when someone stood there, too tired to cook, yet still wanting something sweet. It became known, in some homes, as sugar cream crackers. It started with something already in reach, a sleeve of plain saltine crackers. Dry, crisp, and never meant to be dessert, they were usually reserved for soups or simple meals. But on certain nights, those rules didn't matter. A few crackers were laid out on a plate, their sharp edges lined up without much thought. Then came a thin spread of butter, softened just enough to glide across the surface without tearing it apart. Over that, a spoonful of sugar was sprinkled, sometimes white, sometimes brown, depending on what was closest. And just like that, it was ready. There was no baking, no chilling, no waiting for flavors to develop. It was immediate. The first bite told the whole story, the salt from the cracker, the richness of the butter, and the grainy sweetness of the sugar all blending together in a way that felt strangely complete. For families during the 1930s and 40s, especially in times when ingredients were limited, this kind of dessert wasn't unusual. It was practical. It used what was already there without asking for more. And on nights when the idea of preparing anything else felt impossible, it offered something small, but satisfying. Children often remembered it as a treat, even though it was made from the simplest things imaginable. Adults remembered it differently, as a quiet solution to exhaustion. Today, it's rarely spoken of, almost too plain to be remembered. But in its simplicity, it holds a certain honesty, a reminder that even the smallest combinations could bring comfort when nothing else felt within reach. There was a dessert that felt more like a quiet habit than a recipe, something assembled in the dim light of a kitchen where no one wanted to stay long. It didn't require skill, or even much thought. It was known simply as milk and honey soak. It began with bread, as many tired night desserts did. A slice or two, often the last pieces left in the loaf, slightly dry but still usable. Instead of throwing them away, they were placed into a shallow bowl, torn gently by hand into uneven pieces. Then came the milk. It was poured slowly over the bread, just enough to soften it without turning it into complete mush. The dry edges began to absorb the liquid almost instantly, changing texture in seconds. What had once been stale became tender again, revived in the simplest way possible. After that, a drizzle of honey was added. Not measured, not precise, just enough to bring sweetness. Sometimes it pooled at the bottom, sometimes it clung to the softened bread, but it didn't matter. There was no right way to do it. That was all it took. There was no waiting, no chilling, no baking. It was ready the moment it was made, eaten quietly with a spoon, often standing at the counter or sitting in silence after a long day. For many families, especially during the 1930s and 40s, this wasn't considered a dessert in the traditional sense. It was something in between, a way to avoid waste, a way to create comfort out of almost nothing. It required no extra ingredients, no extra effort, just what was already available. Children sometimes remembered it as warm and gentle, something easy to eat before bed. Adults remembered it differently, as a small act of survival during tiring days. Today, it's nearly forgotten, too simple to compete with modern desserts. But within it remains a quiet truth. Sometimes, the easiest things were the ones that stayed with you the longest. There was a dessert that never needed measuring cups or careful timing. It lived in the space between exhaustion and necessity, when the day had already taken too much, and the kitchen felt like the last place anyone wanted to be. It was often called cinnamon sugar toast, though in many homes it wasn't even given a proper name. It started with the most ordinary thing in the house: bread. White, soft, sometimes slightly stale, always within reach. A slice was placed into a toaster or held carefully over a stove flame in older kitchens, where electric appliances were still a luxury. Within minutes, the bread turned warm and crisp at the edges, filling the room with a simple, comforting smell. Then came the topping. Butter, spread quickly while the toast was still hot enough to melt it into the surface. No precision, no careful layering, just enough to coat the bread before it cooled. After that, a mixture of sugar and cinnamon was sprinkled over the top. Sometimes it was mixed in a small cup, sometimes just shaken directly from containers that were already half empty. And that was it. No baking tray. No waiting for anything to set. Just something warm, sweet, and ready in moments. For families in the mid-20th century, especially during busy mornings or late evenings, this small combination became a quiet comfort. It wasn't celebrated as a recipe. It wasn't written down in detail. It simply happened over and over again, whenever there was a need for something quick and familiar. Children often remember it as a small reward after school, sitting at kitchen tables while the world outside slowed down for a moment. Adults remember it differently, as a bridge between hunger and rest, when there was no time left for anything more elaborate. Today, cinnamon sugar toast still exists in some homes, but its meaning has changed. What was once a necessity now feels like nostalgia. Yet in its simplicity, it still carries the same quiet comfort it always did. There was a dessert that didn't require cooking, waiting, or even much thought. It appeared in kitchens where the day had already drained every bit of energy, and the idea of preparing something complicated felt impossible. It was known in many homes as chocolate bread spread, a simple treat born from exhaustion and whatever was left in the pantry. It began with plain sliced bread, nothing special, often slightly dry from sitting too long on the counter. Instead of discarding it, someone would take a jar of chocolate spread or even cocoa mixed with sugar and a bit of butter, depending on what was available. The bread was laid flat, and the spread was applied quickly, unevenly, almost carelessly. Some days it was thick and rich, other days it was barely enough to tint the surface. Then, another slice of bread was placed on top, forming a soft, makeshift sandwich. There was no heating, no toasting, no transformation beyond what the hands could do in a minute or two. Yet for children, it felt like something special. The sweetness of chocolate, even in its simplest form, carried a sense of reward after long school days or cold evenings. For adults, it was less about indulgence and more about convenience, a way to satisfy a craving without spending any extra time or effort. During the mid-20th century, when processed spreads became more common in American households, this kind of quick dessert quietly found its place. It didn't need approval or recognition. It simply filled a gap between hunger and tiredness. Today, it has almost disappeared from memory, replaced by packaged snacks and modern sweets. But in its simplicity lies a reminder of a time when desserts didn't always come from recipes. Sometimes, they came from fatigue and whatever was close enough to turn into comfort. There was a dessert that asked for almost nothing, yet still managed to end a long day with something sweet. It didn't come from a cookbook or a special occasion. It came from tired kitchens, late evenings, and the quiet need to use whatever was left. It was often remembered as apple cinnamon skillet slices. It started with a few apples, usually ones that had been sitting too long in a bowl, softening at the edges but still usable. Instead of being baked into a pie or turned into something elaborate, they were simply sliced thinly and placed into a small pan. A bit of butter was melted over low heat, just enough to coat the bottom. The apple slices were added, slowly softening as they warmed. Then came a sprinkle of sugar and cinnamon. No exact measurements, just enough to bring out sweetness and warmth. There was no crust, no dough, no waiting for anything to rise or set. The apples softened in minutes, releasing their natural juices and blending with the sugar into a light, syrupy glaze. The smell alone was enough to feel like comfort. For many families in earlier decades, especially when time and ingredients were limited, this was a small solution at the end of exhausting days. It wasn't considered fancy or festive. It was practical, quick, and deeply satisfying in its own quiet way. Children often remember it as something warm served in small bowls, sometimes eaten directly from the pan. Adults remember it differently, as a moment of relief, when something simple could still feel complete. Today, apple cinnamon skillet slices have almost faded from memory, replaced by more polished desserts. But in those soft, caramelized edges lies a reminder of a time when sweetness didn't need effort, only what was already within reach. And that's where these forgotten desserts begin to fade, quiet recipes born not from celebration, but from exhaustion, simplicity, and survival. In a time when kitchens didn't always promise comfort, people still found ways to create something sweet from almost nothing. No fancy tools, no perfect measurements, just instinct and whatever was left in the pantry. Today, we rarely think about desserts like these, yet they once carried families through the longest days. If this journey into forgotten American kitchens stirred something in you, stay with us. There are more lost recipes, hidden stories, and quiet traditions still waiting to be remembered.